To get started then. Good afternoon, everyone. Very warm welcome to this panel discussion on marital rape and the law in India, part of the 2021 Prajna 16 Days campaign against gender violence. My name is S. Shakti. I'm a Prajna trustee and volunteer. Now, some of you might have seen that, the title of this panel is Does Marriage Mean Consent? Now, we want to emphasize that, especially as a feminist organization, we do strongly advocate for the right to either give or withhold consent, as an absolute right. And really, the reason we've posed this as a question is to try and cast a spotlight on what the law in India says or doesn't say about marital rape. And what this tells us more broadly about the institutional framing of consent. India is now really in the minority of countries that does not have a sort of formal law for recognizing marital rape as a criminal offense. The law is, after all, a deeply social institution. And what we really want to highlight and understand better through this session is the context in which really, especially the exception to Section 375 of the Indian Penal Code that explicitly excludes marital rape from being recognized as a form of rape in India continues to exist. In order to do this, we are absolutely delighted to have with us two excellent panelists today, Audrey de Mello and Juma Sen. We were also meant to have Madhu Bhushan, formerly from Vimochana, with us today to moderate the session, but unfortunately, she can't join us today because of a family emergency. I would like to introduce both panelists before we proceed. I'll start with Audrey. Audrey de Mello joined Majlis, a forum for women's rights discourse and legal initiatives based in Mumbai in 2007 as a program director. While working in the field of program implementation, she acquired a degree in law from Bombay University and a postgraduate degree in management from Narsi Monji Institute of Management Studies. Apart from streamlining existing programs around access to justice and evolving internal control systems and monitoring mechanisms, she has been instrumental in shaping Majlis's collaborations with the government in two important areas: the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act 2005 and Rahat, a program which provides support to survivors of sexual violence and aims to bring in systems for state accountability towards victims. Towards this end, she has developed protocols, guidelines, and training modules for various stakeholders, including the judiciary and the police. Now on to Juma Sen. Juma Sen is a lawyer, academic, and policy consultant whose research and practice interests include human rights, gender justice, and anti-discrimination law. She appears before the Indian Supreme Court and various high courts and tribunals and teaches at Jindal Global Law School, where she is also the assistant director of the Center for Human Rights Studies. She is currently a global fellow at the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies at Brown University. She holds an undergraduate law degree from Symbiosis Law School and a postgraduate law degree from the University of California, Berkeley. She has held several visiting faculty positions and fellowships at universities and research organizations in India and abroad, including the R. Rajaram Grit Research Fellowship at Prajna in 2018. She was a part of the Justice Verma Committee deliberations and is engaged with the National Human Rights Commission, National Commission for Women, the Law Commission of India, and the Supreme Court on several issues relating to access to gender justice. She is also a convener for the Indian Feminist Judgments Project, a project that reimagines legal judgments through a feminist lens. She is currently preparing two book manuscripts, the first one tentatively titled Breaking the Bar, Early Women Lawyers and the Legal Profession in India, and the second, Courting Family, Public Life of Private Laws. I will now hand over to Audrey and then to Juma. Each of them will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, following which you will have a discussion and take questions from the audience. I request everyone to please keep your mics on mute while the panelists are speaking. You will have the opportunity to unmute and ask questions once they have both finished. In the meanwhile, if you would like to pose a question or a comment in the chat box at any time, please feel free to do so. I'll now hand over to Audrey.
Thanks, Shakti. Soumya, would you like to start with your opening comments?
No, Audrey. It's after you and Juma speak that I will come in as a discussant to respond to some of the issues that both of you bring up in your presentation.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. So hello everyone, and thank you so much, Swarna, for inviting me to this program. When I spoke to Swarna first, and she talked about the issue of marital rape and wanting to have a discussion about it, I would say, wondering how one should put this across, because it's been years of demand for a law specifying the issue of marital rape, and yet there are so many ground realities that we are facing on a day-to-day level. So it's just really a very difficult topic that one has to be, tentatively explore while we are doing that, and it's nice that we can do this in this safe space. I'm going to be speaking mostly from my experience of working with Majlis and working closely with implementation of law, and to bring in the different aspects that we have been grappling with on the ground. I'm going to start with saying that, and put it out there, that it is not true that India does not have a law on marital rape. That is a false statement. That is a wrong statement. And that statement has been getting, a lot of hype, a lot of publicity. And the reality is that today, every student who, contacts Majlis invariably is doing a project, a paper, something around the issue of marital rape. And the most direct question they ask me is, how come marital rape is not a crime in this country? And my answer to them is that marital rape is a crime in this country, is very much a crime in this country. And it is not true that that men can rape their wives because we have laws to deal with this. So that's my first statement. Just to give you context, what I am talking about is, yes, it is not included in section 376. That's true. Marital rape is not included in section 376. There is an exclusion mentioned under section 376. However, in 1983, we very clearly got a law on cruelty to wives, which is section 498A IPC, which says, and I quote, that any cruelty by the husband or his, by the husband on a woman, and that can be physical or mental, is a crime, and it is punishable with 3 years imprisonment. For me and for everyone here, the definition of physical cruelty would include all kinds of cruelty on the wife, all kinds of physical cruelty on the wife. So definitely beating her with their hands, with objects, with, would be the actual physical cruelty that we understand. But physical cruelty could also be forcing her to have sex. like the way mental cruelty includes all emotional abuse and all kinds of verbal, abuse that may be happening to her, because the definition is that large. It is physical or mental abuse. So no kind of physical or mental abuse is permitted, and definitely, in my opinion, that sexual abuse is a kind of physical abuse. Now, going back to where I'd like to start is that, to give you a context, Majlis has been working on the issue of domestic violence for the past 30 years. And for the past 10 years, we have been very, very closely working on the ground in cases of rape. So we are coming to this issue from both spaces. When we started in 1991, we were working more with personal laws to help women get their rights. We were using Section 125 CRPC, which is a right to maintenance, to help women get their maintenance, and selectively use Section 498A if a woman was seeking punishment. However, in our experience, the women who opted to file a criminal case against their husband under Section 498A was very, very, very few. I would say it was negligible in our experience on the ground, working in Mumbai and working exclusively on cases of domestic violence. Because as a legal center who was providing women with legal advice and then helping them access justice, approach courts, women were more often than not and very clearly demanding for reliefs. What they were saying is that, yes, I am facing domestic abuse, I am facing physical abuse, I am facing verbal abuse, emotional abuse. And currently my situation is such that my husband refuses to maintain me, and I am coming to you for that. He is not providing me with maintenance. In over 90% of our cases or more, the women mostly articulating this need that they are not being maintained. They are not even receiving money from their husbands. They've been denied money from their husbands to even survive and for the survival of their children. The other common relief that women were asking was for residence. I want an order to be able, I want that my husband either provides me with a residence in our home or provides me with an alternate residence. These are the two highest demands that women came to us with, saying that this is the relief we are seeking. And to help them access those reliefs, they had a choice of filing 125 CRPC for maintenance, or filing under the personal laws for right of residence. And they had a choice of filing under Section 498A for punishment. But most of them opted for reliefs. Now, the reason why, if you ask me, they were not opting for Section 498A was because Section 498A is a law which is geared towards punishment. Assuming all things being perfect, if a woman went to a police station, told the police that she was facing violence and abuse and cruelty, and she met the most perfect police officer and he recorded a case in the best manner possible, and he sent the charge sheet to court on time, and the case was tried in court, and evidence was produced, and her statement was recorded, and everything went perfectly. At the end of that case, the result or the victory would have been 3 years punishment to the husband. But the question she was asking is, I am seeking relief. I am seeking relief for maintenance. I am seeking relief for residence. I am seeking relief for my children. So if the husband is going to be in jail, how am I going to get my release? So even though she had the option of filing under Section 498A, she did not choose to use that option because it defeated her purpose of relief. Which comes to the point that suppose her husband was sexually abusing her, was raping her, that would also amount to cruelty. She could very well go to the police station and talk about this abuse, and it would come under the definition of Section 498A. I want to move to another space here and talk about our experience of women's hesitation, women being uncomfortable with talking about sexual violence. While women will describe in detail stories about violence, physical violence to them, physical abuse, beating, beating with hand, beating with other objects. They talk about the verbal abuse, the emotional abuse. They're very hesitant to talk about sexual abuse. And it's difficult to describe that incident in the same manner that it is difficult to describe the incident even for victims of rape. It's very traumatic, it's very difficult to explain, to describe. And so they mostly don't talk about it till you kind of draw it out from them. And even while they talk about it, the whole focus is on the relief that, because there's a lot of acceptance by women of different kinds of violence on them, because there's really they look at it as they have no choice. But when they are in a very desperate situation is when they come out and talk about it, because what they're seeking for is the relief. And so they focus on that. And so when we talk about our experience of cases of rape, and just to put on record that while Majlis has been doing cases of rape for the past 10 years, and our intention of our program is to support victims of rape through the trial and provide all kinds of other support to them. And it's a program for women and children, but almost 85% of our cases have ended up becoming cases of children. The cases of rape that we work with are invariably, a lot of the cases are cases of rape on children. Because of mandatory reporting, these cases come forward, these cases are reported, and these girls have to, talk about these incidents of rape. And these are rapes by, as all of us know sitting here, that most of the cases are by known people. And when I say known people, I mean very close people. You're talking about fathers, grandfathers, brothers, uncles, brothers, sisters, husbands, very, very close family members, and then neighbors and other kind of relationships. And when women have to kind of narrate those incidents of rape, it is extremely traumatic for them to describe it, and for even for the police when they're recording it. And that's why we know that why so many cases of rape, women refuse to come out and speak about it. Of course, because of mandatory reporting, they're out there, right? Instances like Nirbhaya, instances like, other incidents that have happened thereafter, and the whole journey of rape cases has resulted in, every time there's a high profile case, we're asking for more and more stringent punishment. So we've moved from 7 years and now we've reached death penalty. And that's how stringent the punishment has become. And what we have seen, and a lot of you must have also experienced, is the more stringent the punishment, the more difficult it is to kind of get people to report. Because you're talking about, you have to place in perspective that it is not always a Nirbhaya case where the accused is the stranger, and that much easier to and also she's dead, So going through a trial on a case like that, as compared to filing a rape case against your brother or your father or your neighbor, and going through this trial where the punishment is going to be, life or 15 years or death, is extremely traumatic. So more stringent the punishment doesn't always mean, people are filing and more comfortable filing better cases. Okay. So now, just to again put this whole thing together, what we are saying is, and at least I want to say, is that marital rape is a crime in this country. It is not okay in this country to rape your wife. It is not true that India does not have a law on addressing the issue of marital rape. On the other hand, more stringent the punishment doesn't mean that, it's better or it's easier or it's, it results in better outcomes. Now, given these two scenarios, what I'd like to kind of bring together is the issue of domestic violence. Right? So are we now on a technical ground? Are we now on a technical ground that, okay, we agree that marital rape is a crime, but it is not a crime under 376 where the punishment is 7 years. It is only a crime under 498A where the punishment is 3 years. So we can argue on that technical difference, right? That as per section 498A, okay, if you say that, you can interpret physical abuse as also rape, but at the end, he'll get only 3 years punishment, as against if we include it in the section of 376, where he will get 7 years punishment. So if we are on that technical ground, then I would like to put forward that, are we then saying that rape in a domestic violence situation is here, but if he beats you, if he breaks your head, if he doesn't give you food and starves you, if he does any other kind of violence, it's here? Are we then saying that? Are we putting rape on a pedestal in a situation of domestic violence where we are saying if your husband rapes you, then the crime should be 7 years and the punishment should be 7 years. But if he breaks your head and causes other physical violence to you and other abuse to you, then it's lesser. Because that's what we would be saying. Which I feel is problematic. Because I feel it's problematic in more ways than one, because even if I have to take only sexual abuse in a marital context, sexual abuse is not only when your husband rapes you, it is also when your husband refuses to have sex with you. That itself is abuse. When the husband brings other women and has sex with them in front of you is also abuse. Denying me sex is abuse as much as him forcing himself on me. So even in the comparison of sexual abuse, will you then do his penetration or whatever on me is higher offense, so should be included in rape and 376, and then all the rest is not really so important, so let's put it at at the lesser crime? And that would be problematic. So I think that what we need, and this is what I would like to conclude by saying, is what we need is to relook at section 498A. Bring more clarity into the definitions of 498A. Put out there the different crimes that happen in a domestic relationship. And by all means, if we are here to kind of have, if everyone's out to say, okay, more stringent the punishment, then let all crimes of domestic violence reach that level, whatever is the hope of 7 years, 15 years, life, death, whatever. But why should it be excluded? Because in a domestic relationship, all these kind of violence is all interlinked. It's not like my husband rapes me, but he doesn't beat me, or he doesn't starve me, or he takes care of my children. It's all there, interplaying. So we need to look at it as a whole and not isolate this and feel that adding it in 376 is somehow giving us more rights, because really, what is it going to achieve? I think I'll stop here and I will hand it back to you.
Thanks a lot, Audrey. That was, I think, given us a lot to think about. We'll now move on to Jhuma for her presentation.
Hi, sorry, I've been multitasking. It's a work day. And thank you, thank you, Prajna, and a very warm, greetings to all of you from very cold and clammy Calcutta, because it's been raining, for a while here since the last 2 days. There's a cyclone approaching. My internet connection, I'm, giving you a slight warning. It's a little patchy today. And I really liked Audrey's presentation and what she had to say, because I think it is really important to debunk the myth that we do not, that we do have a law, on marital rape. It is not a case that we do not have a law on marital rape. What I will try to do today is, this was what my mandate was, that when I was earlier invited by Prajna to speak on marital rape, I said that I'm going to sort of act like a detective and trace the footprints of marital rape or marital rape discourse in India. When I say marital rape discourse, it's not just the discourse, not just the judicial discourse, but also the discourse in public space, the discourse in parliament and legislature and so on and so forth. So I'll try to map some of it in a bit, and then maybe touch upon some of the complexities of this discourse as it is. So marital rape, I think all of us here are quite, we are aware why the marital rape exemption, the logic, the reason behind the marital rape exemption to exist in the statute book. And India is not just an exception. India is not the only country to have a marital rape exemption by way of the exception 2 to section 375. There have been other countries as well. We do have, these that, our Indian Penal Code is is of Victorian, is of colonial origin. This is a Macaulay code. We know all that. We also have a fair idea that what this logic is, and that logic is that historically rape was only acknowledged throughout history in most societies. There was no concept of rape on wife, and because it was really acceptable for men to force their wives, force themselves on their wives and have sex with them against their will. And in fact, if one looks at the traditional definition of rape, one will find that in most countries, the sexual intercourse with a female, not his wife, without her consent was the definition of rape. In other words, that there was already an inbuilt exemption clause to rape in the form of a spousal rape exemption or a marital rape exemption. In fact, if one looks at sort of common law jurisdictions, and you know the very infamous words of Matthew Hale, we say now infamous, back in those days this was pretty much the order of the day. Matthew Hale was a Chief Justice of England in the 17th century, and he had noted, he had written that a husband cannot be guilty of rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife, because by their mutual consent and contract, the wife has given up herself unto her husband, and which is something that she cannot retract. So there is this notion of continuity of consent, a form of consent which cannot be retracted. So the moment you marry, you enter into a contract of marriage with a man, you are, it is deemed that you have given up your consent. You cannot retract, which is in the normal way we understand that consent is, of course, consent cannot be, it cannot, it is not a case where a consent once given cannot be retracted. Consent can be retractable. So this is the larger logic. Now there is a lot of noise, there's a lot of discussion on criminalizing of marital rape, and this has largely been the demand of several women's groups, and I will come to that in a bit. But first, this is just about what the law says. So the Indian Penal Code, if you look at the Indian Penal Code is an 1860 legislation. It states that in a marriage, there is an implied, it indicates, it doesn't state, it indicates that there is an implied consent for sexual intercourse, which cannot be, sort of retracted, which cannot be done away with, so on and so forth. If one looks at section 375 of the IPC, we see that penetration without informed consent will be categorized as rape. But the exception 2 is something that takes away that sort of that protection, that protective cover. And what when it does that, what does it do? There is a form of discrimination between, it's creating two classes of citizens. One is the wife and the other is the non-wife. So exception 2 is something that discriminates against married women. How does it do that? It does that by refusing them the equal protection of from rape, which section 375 contains. So this has been so this is basically the one of the contention. This is one of the reason why women's groups have been arguing. Many women's groups, I will not say all women's groups, many women's groups have been arguing about this categorization, stating that this categorization is directly violative of the test of reasonable classification, which is the test, your section 14 test, the test of equality. So in this scenario, if one tries to map, so we know what the logic is, and we know what the logic of the argument against that exception is. Now, I will come back to this constitutional argument in a bit, because I think post Puttaswamy things have become a little different. As far as this discourse goes, this discourse that can be presented in the juridical arena, this discourse that is dominating perhaps the public space, I think this discourse has undergone some change post Puttaswamy. And before that, there has been, of course, there's been the independent thought, which partially sort of, removed that blanket. And I will also discuss that in a bit. Now, going back to the sort of this history of, of this, not this history, but this debate on criminalization of marital rape. Like I earlier said, that there has been, this has been a very long-standing demand made by women's movements, by women's groups in India. And in fact, if one looks at the Justice Verma Committee, which in the recent times, it's seen as, one of the most comprehensive piece of reports on sexual, on sexual violence. And the Justice Verma Committee had also, stated very categorically that marital rape stems from an extremely outdated notion of marriage, which regards wives as property or as chattel of husbands. And it had suggested that that exemption should be removed, because the existence of a marital relationship is not a valid defense against sexual, against sexual violence committed in the course of the relationship. But as we know that this recommendation, this was ignored by the state, and it arbitrarily picked up certain suggestions. Audrey was speaking about sentencing. That is again another problematic aspect, because sentencing, nowhere in the Verma Committee did it suggest, was there any recommendation about enhanced or increased sentence, in other words, to sort of remove this discretion of the judges as far as sexual offenses go. But we know that the state did it, and there is a whole lot has to be said about the nature of this carceral state and what it really does when it increases punishment, when it removes discretion, takes away discretion from judges, because at the end of the day, women are the ones who suffer, because higher the higher the punishment, more severe the punishment, more the chances of acquittal, lesser the chances of punishment. So anyway, so the committee, coming back to the post Verma Committee phase, there has been a couple of other suggestions leading to the Verma Committee. In the 42nd Law Commission report, for example, the Law Commission of India had actually put forward the necessity of excluding marital rape from the ambit of section 375, and they had stated that the prosecution for these offenses are actually quite rare, so this should be removed altogether out of the ambit of 375, and because it should not be called rape, even in a very technical sense. Around that time, there was a task force on women and children, which was set up by the Women and Child Department, the MWCD, and they took the view that there should be a wider debate on this issue. So the mandate of that task force was actually to look at and review all existing legislations and schemes pertaining to women, and there were several recommendations made by the task force, and out of that there was a recommendation with reference to rape under the Indian Penal Code, and it took the position that the definition of rape should be broadened to include all forms of sexual abuse, and the Law Commission then proposed the definition of sexual assault should be adopted in place of the existing definition of rape in 375, because it was more it was broader, it was more comprehensive, and it was more acceptable. But like the Law Commission, the task force also stopped short of recommending the inclusion of marital rape in the new definition. Then after that, you see that there was the 172nd Law Commission report, which was another very significant report. This was in 2000, and this also made certain recommendations for changes in the law regarding to rape. And here also it stated that for sexual intercourse by husband with his wife should be treated equally as an offense, just as any physical violence by a husband against the wife is treated as an offense. So on the same reasoning, it said that the section 376A was to be deleted. Now, notwithstanding this report, which was submitted to the government of India, which urged the parliament that it should replace the definition of rape under section 375 with a broader definition of sexual assault. Nothing was really done. Now, I'm not going through all the all the law commission reports, or because there have been several commission reports, and not just law commission reports, but there have been like charcha in that sense on marital rape. I'm not going to go through all of these, but what I will briefly talk about is what happens when this discourse sort of this marital rape discourse. I don't want to get into the sort of the nitty-gritties of why women use it and whether women use it at all in the sense of in domestic violence and marital rape as a sexual abuse in marriage as a ground for divorce. I think that is a conversation to be had like at the end of this discussion. But let me tell a bit about the Constitution of India and how marital rape, how the sort of this public discourse or this constitutional discourse has been emerging. Now, most you will all probably be familiar with the independent thought judgment, and there we know that there was seemingly a problem because the marital rape exemption, and then you had POCSO, and then different categories and different classes of wives who were subjected to sexual abuse. So different categories and classifications were made, and the Supreme Court and the independent thought approached the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court read down the exception 2 of section 375 and altered it to mean that sexual intercourse by a man with his wife, the wife not being less than 18 years of age, is not rape. And this is really, marital rape. In fact, marital rape has come before the court on a number of occasions. Independent thought is a very recent example. If you look at the colonial history, you will see that from Phulmani Dasi, this is really this marital rape was something that triggered the age of consent debate, and to sort of paraphrase Tanika Sarkar, who has written extensively on this, that consent, if you look at the age of consent debate, the idea of consent in the colonial era, in the colonial discourse, was the consent to have sex as long as you were not dead. So your consent was understood in your physical ability, your capacity to have sex and not die. So you had the Phulmani Dasi case, which triggered a huge response, and the Phulmani Dasi, and then the Rukmabai case. These together actually, Phulmani Dasi was the immediate trigger. This is Phulmani Dasi's. This is Hariman Maiti. This is Hariman Maiti. So these two cases were the ones. This case, particularly this case, was the one that triggered, was the immediate trigger to marital, to the age of consent debate, and eventually to the passage of the Age of Consent Act. as far as independent thought goes, we know that responses to independent thought have also been very, very diverse and very, very very mixed, because if you look at the judgment in independent thought, there is a section on child marriage, and the reason why the courts did not outright say that this was bad and all that, because there was a social reality of child marriage. So there's a general consensus appears to be that the decision actually raises many issues about child sexual abuse and child marriage, as it clarifies regarding marital rape of minor wives. So this is one of the reasons why this case has come under a thorough scrutiny. But when the question in independent thought, when the question came before the Supreme Court that will this decision apply to the marital rape of adult women, the court, which is the marital rape simpliciter, the court categorically stated that, we make it clear that we have refrained from making any observation with regard to the marital rape of a woman who is 18 years of age and above, since the issue is not before us. Therefore, we should not be understood to advert to that issue even collaterally. So this is a very sort of a hands-off approach. This is a very sort of judicial kind of I don't want to say abdication, but this is like really a smart way to bypass this this everything that is that's happening before the court. Now of course there's been there's been the independent thought case, but more importantly, if one looks at the post independent thought, if one looks at, there have been a string of other judgments, and not just judgments, you see that even India is a signatory to CEDAW, and even the CEDAW had proposed in its resolution that marital rape should be criminalized, and this sort of discrimination is an infringement on equality and human dignity. And when it comes to equality and human dignity, the Supreme Court has been sort of as far as substantive equality goes, it has started walking on a particular road now. Especially if one looks at Puttaswamy, and if one thinks of the ideas of dignity and equality, because even earlier, even before Puttaswamy, you had in Chandrima Das, for example, and then there was this the Krishnappa judgment. It was categorically stated that rape is a crime against human rights, and it is an unlawful intrusion into the right of privacy and the sanctity of a woman, which is guaranteed under Article 21. And now in Puttaswamy, the court is a 9-judge bench judgment, and the court has categorically stated that sexual privacy is a fundamental right of all citizens, and forced sexual act would be a clear violation of that right. So and actually none of these judgments do make any distinction between the rights of married and unmarried women, and therefore I think the future will be interesting. If this question comes before the court, the future the future of public discourse, judicial discourse on the subject of marital rape will be really interesting, especially post Puttaswamy. That said, this is just like sort of kind of taking a bird's eye view on what the discourse has been, what it looks like. But that said, Audrey earlier raised some really important questions, and one of these questions is that even if you criminalize it, I am a very uncomfortable with this idea of criminalization, because criminalization may serve its purpose, and at some points of time. I think Section 498A has in some way shown that it that in whatever way it has been used, it has shown that it serves a certain purpose, albeit in a limited way, but it serves a certain purpose. But the question is that even if one criminalizes, let's say criminalizes marital rape, will that make women come forward and talk about it? I have had in the past, I have had in matrimonial cases, I have had clients who have come, women clients, and who have come and who have said that they, of course, they're not very comfortable talking about it, and this also depends largely on one's class, caste, and multiple other locations, because that is what informs how someone will really approach or broach this subject. But I have had clients in the past who have said that there have been, they don't call it marital rape because they're not perhaps familiar with the language of marital rape, the legal vocabulary of marital rape, but they say that this is zabardasti. So that the husband would come, and it doesn't happen just once, it happens multiple times. There is a certain sense of reputation. For those of you, I don't know how many Bengalis are there. I think I'm the only one, but there is a very well-known film called Dohon. It was based on a on a real life incident of a rape of a woman, and then she had another woman who was sort of who witnessed it, and who so it's really this tale of these two women. And there was this scene in the film, and when I watched it, I was very young. I didn't have any, only when later I sort of rewatched it, I figured out that this is what was marital rape is, because there is this particular scene where this woman is the husband, who is otherwise a very nice husband, very gentle, very nice man, very gentle, very sweet and generous, but he also changes after his wife has been gang raped, and he at some point of time later, he forces, because the woman is not very comfortable with the touch of even her husband, and he at some point of time forces himself on her. And when you see it, it doesn't if you're really, if you're uninformed, if you're living under a rock, or if you're uninformed, I'm sure our audience and our co-panelists are not here, but for someone, when I watched it for the first time, and I was in school, and it didn't really strike me, and when I much later I rewatched it, I was like, oh, this is actually marital rape. So the thing is, why this sort of this diversion, this digression to this film, is that it is really, not everyone will probably also see it as they might be offended. A woman might be offended, might see it as something which is very harsh, and something which is absolutely should not be in a matrimonial, that should not find a place in a matrimonial relationship, like, for example, husband beating wife, or husband whatever, but the thing is, it is not necessarily seen as, like most other things in a matrimonial home, it is not necessarily, perhaps not always, but not necessarily seen as something which is a crime. So even if she she understands that it is bad or whatever, it is going to be an unlikely scenario that a woman will, a wife in this case, will go and file a criminal case if there is a criminal law. What one could do is, or what one could of course imagine doing is to just remove that exemption, which is in a way, which means that your husband is not, the husband is not is not protected by that exception anymore, the exception to 375. But that is a debate for another day. I think I'll stop here. I think I'm past 15 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Juma. I think both your talks actually complemented each other quite well, because you gave us more of a sort of legal history of how in the country we've looked at marital rape, and Audrey, of course, gave us her perspectives from working with people who come to our organization seeking legal help for dealing with domestic violence more broadly, and sometimes spousal rape more specifically. So I think they went together extremely well. I do have some questions, but I'd like to first invite Professor Soumya Uma, if she'd like to say anything at this point. Professor Uma teaches at Jindal Global Law School, and we're very happy to have her here as part of the discussion. If you would like to comment on the presentations.
Thank you, Shakti, and thank you, Audrey and Juma, for that very interesting viewpoints, and actually Prajna for providing this platform for us to be able to, talk about it, as Audrey said, in a safe space. I just want to, I'll start with, something that, Juma talked about and her issues. I just want to respond a little bit to that, and then a brief response to Audrey. Juma was talking about the historical development of the discourse around marital rape, and she was talking about this whole aspect of consent. So now, where that consent in marriage came from was from the doctrine of one flesh and doctrine of coverture, which were important doctrines in common law. And according to these doctrines, husband and wife merged their identities after marriage and they became one flesh. And whose flesh was that? I mean, it was, of course, the husband. So wife lost her identity and autonomy over her body as well as her property, and husband had control over her properties as well as her person. So that is where the present exception to section 375 comes from. Now, this doctrine of coverture has shaped, informed, influenced various laws, various legal provisions in India. So marital rape is only one of them. Non-recognition of marital rape or exemption for marital rape is one of them. But the other is the whole criminal law on adultery. The one other provision is restitution of conjugal rights. And a fourth provision is the matrimonial provision of aggrieved husband claiming damages from the adulterer for violating his right to his wife's person. So I just want to, say what has happened on all the other provisions. So we had a criminal law on adultery, and the Joseph Schein judgment struck it down. Using constitutional provisions of equality and non-discrimination. Restitution of conjugal rights, a matrimonial remedy by which a wife can be forced to return to the company of her husband. Facially, it is gender neutral, but indirect discrimination is much more on the woman because of the disparate impact of it on the woman. And restitution of conjugal rights as a matrimonial remedy has now come up as come up for constitutional challenge. It's pending in the Supreme Court. The third aspect, which I talked about, which is husband claiming damages from the adulterer. This was in the Indian Divorce Act. It has now been, that provision has been repealed through certain amendments that have come. And the fourth aspect is non-recognition of marital rape. So I would like to see all of this holistically in terms of looking at the autonomy, sexual autonomy, bodily integrity, and bodily privacy of the woman, and particularly the married woman, in the context of all these provisions and what has happened to it. During the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a high prevalence of domestic violence, not only in India, but other countries, but marital rape has not been recognized. It is not a special provision on which the NCRB gathers data, so we don't really know what is the data that is available. the feminist demand in India has been there has been no unanimous position, of course, but I want to go back to what Jhuma ended her presentation with, which was about withdrawing the exception to marital, exception to the provision of rape, because if you do not remove that exception, it signals that women's consent to sexual intimacy is irrelevant within a marriage, and it signals that husbands have unlimited, unrestricted access to the wife's person. That has been a demand in successive debates for law reform. Of course, criminalizing marital rape may strengthen the arm of the state without providing any real redress for women. And at a point where we are at a stage of hyper criminalization, even going out during the pandemic without a mask can lead to police action, and it can lead to imprisonment. So we are at a stage of hyper criminalization, and further criminalization may only strengthen the arm of the state. And in the current political context in India, that is a big question mark, whether we want to further criminalize marital rape or not. But the reason why some or many women's groups have been demanding the repeal of that exception for marital rape in Section 375 IPC is because it is a normative standard. It is a standard which is signaling that husbands have, that as far as husbands are concerned, they have unlimited, unrestricted access to the wife's person. Now, coming to the argument that Audrey has made, of course, it is true that 498A includes physical and mental cruelty. But over the last 15, 20 years, even though 498A, when it came in, was a very, very significant provision that was brought in. And to me, one of the main aspects of significance was that it was one of the very important statements that law was making, that what happens within the home is not necessarily something that law will not intervene. This whole thing that, earlier in the 1980s, we had this judgment which said that bringing constitutional law into the home is like bringing a bull into the china shop. So 498A first, and then the Domestic Violence Act, they show very clearly that law does have a role to play whenever there is violence, even within the privacy of the four walls of the home. So in that sense, removing that exception becomes important. But the other aspect which Audrey has pointed out, which is, the practical aspects, the ground level aspects, these cannot be ignored, and they are very, very important in that what do we do about, are we putting marital rape on a pedestal by saying we want to criminalize marital rape, but we won't criminalize other forms of sexual violence that happen within marriage. And she pointed out 2 or 3 instances of different kinds of sexual violence, which is depriving the woman of sex and so on. I think what is being argued here is not necessarily about criminalizing marital rape, but about removing the exception to marital rape. One can say that ultimately that would amount to criminalizing, but I think this is where the normative role of law becomes very important. And I just want to end my comment with some of the challenges that we are facing today to criminalizing marital rape. And one is the legal challenge, and both Audrey and Jhuma have pointed this out. two different, slightly different kinds of positions. The legal challenge to actually removing it, as Justice Verma committee had suggested. The second is a social challenge, where we have women internalizing an acceptance of marital rape. It is part of internalized patriarchy, not only among men who think that they have the right to force themselves on their wife, but it's also internalized acceptance of marital rape among women, and they won't even use the term rape. So I think we also have a social challenge which we must recognize and see how to deal with it. So it's a normalized form of violence among men, and it's an internalized acceptance among women. So what do we do about that? And leading to that is the political challenge, of course. So we see a lack of political will, because despite Justice Verma committee recommendations, we see that the state was not interested. And if we look at the parliamentary debate around it subsequent to Verma committee recommendations, it's been, this is, we have a social and cultural milieu in our country, and marital rape provision will disrupt it, and so on. So I think this is where we are. And I would think that in addition to the legal challenges, we need to look at social as well as political challenges. Thank you for this opportunity, Shakti and Prajna.
Thank you so much. Juma, would you like to respond? Is there anything you'd like to say?
No, I agree with Soumya, that I didn't touch upon it, on the philosophical question why it should go, but I think it should go. It's a different question. It's a different question altogether. What happens when it goes, and what are the challenges of making it go? But it is a normative. I don't disagree. I don't disagree with her. It is a normative issue. I also do understand, and I mentioned this, when I spoke as well, that there are other issues. It's a complex issue. Once it goes, does it automatically mean that women are going to, line up in the police station and file, complaints of, rape complaints against their husbands? They're not going to do that. Most of them are dependent on them financially and otherwise. So it's a complex question. But as far as the, sort of identifying the normative issue here, that why it should go. I mean, it should go because in the same manner, Joseph Schein has decriminalized adultery. It should go in the same way. The restitution of conjugal rights is again, is in challenge in the Ojasva Pathak case before the Supreme Court. It should go in the same manner, because I think what I said was, during my part of the talk, that things are going to be interesting post Puttaswamy. Things are going to be interesting. We need to wait and watch what happens, because actually this marital rape, the fact that marital rape should go, or the demand that marital rape should go, the marital rape should go in the sense the exemption, the marital rape exemption should go. This has increased after Puttaswamy, because Puttaswamy has made it very categorically clear that your sexual privacy is something that it is a fundamental right, and it has to be protected. I leave the sort of the complexity and the nuance, what happens when it goes and all that, to I think to Audrey, Soumya, Swarna and others.
Thanks, Juma. I think we've lost Audrey, but hopefully she'll be able to join us again. I think she's having some trouble with her internet connection.
We have Anuradha back.
Okay. We do also have a question in the chat box, which I'd like to read out. And then I would also like to invite Anuradha Kapoor from Swayam, who's also in attendance here today, if she'd like to comment as well on this. Swayam has, of course, been working for over 25 years with survivors of domestic violence. I will first read out the question in the chat. It's from Monolita Chatterjee. She says women's bodily integrity is a very less recognized right, and marital rape is one of the biggest examples of this. To lump it as one which would harm the institution of marriage is simply strange. As social workers, we face domestic violence cases where marital rape and sexual violence is part and parcel of a domestic violence case. I would like to ask why marital rape, that is when it is without consent, be classified in the same way as other rapes. And if Professor, if Juma, if Ms. Anuradha or anyone would like to comment on this, please go ahead.
I think it's a very complicated question. And it's not a very easy answer, but I do think somewhere we need to reflect on the fact that, why is it that rape is considered to be the worst offense possible? Isn't that a patriarchal thought? I mean, if a woman is being abused and she's being abused in a way which is undermining her mental situation, her, physically in other ways, why is that any less than sexual abuse? I think that is the question that we really need to answer for ourselves. In a way that bothers me, because I feel we're again going into that understanding that if a woman is raped, it's worse than if you lose a limb or an eye or whatever. So why are we looking at it in that manner? I think it is domestic violence. There's no two ways about it. But why are we placing a hierarchy here is maybe something that we need to look at. I don't have answers, but I do have this as a question, is that why are we looking at rape as the worst form of abuse for a woman? And so if we do have physical abuse of other kinds within this, and we do have rape as one of the forms of sexual violence, then why are we segregating the two? That's an issue.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment? And Monalita Chatterjee, also, if you'd like to unmute and ask a follow-up, anything, please feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, hi. No, I was not talking about it in terms of not as a hierarchical question. It is a very simple thing where what happens is when we are working on domestic. So I am part of an NGO, a gender rights organization, and we work on ground with survivors of various sexual violence and domestic violence, gender-based violences, and we find that sexual violence and marital rape happens almost to all of our domestic violence victims. And the problem that we face is that unless it is something which is really egregious, we cannot actually manage to bring in the clauses of all the rape laws as a part of the police complaint or as a part of the legal complaint in the legal case. And that has always been something which is been a little bit of a weak point for any of these cases. No, there is no hierarchy. I do not consider a mental abuse to be any less important than sexual violence, but when we are looking for justice for victims, all of these aspects become extremely important. And I work with young girls who for 5, 6, 7 years have gone through everyday rape from their husbands, and they didn't even manage to recognize it as a problem, because even when they went to lawyers, to legal recourses, they were told that that part is not actually eligible. So that was my question, really.
No, but what I was trying to say was that under 498A, we can get all of these forms are included as, as abuse. So you have that section that is available to you. And most women don't want to do, say, for example, the women have an option. You can go to the criminal law, you can go to the civil law, or you can go to both. And under both the criminal and the civil law as it stands today, they can put in a complaint, which talks about this part, especially under PWDVA, it's very clear that sexual abuse is part of domestic violence. And under 498A also, we can talk about, the problem with 498A is, I feel it's like a law that is left totally to the imagination of the person who's sitting across the desk.
Yeah,
And so that is
absolutely.
a huge problem in its implementation, right? So when you're writing this down, as you said, if the person across the, does not have that understanding that this is a form of sexual abuse, because all forms of abuse come under 498A, then we're in trouble. And so maybe that suggestion that Audrey had said, that you clarify much more, like you have done in PWDVA, where you've really listed a huge number of offenses as offenses of domestic violence and said this is not a complete list, like it can be more along the same lines. I think that is the issue. But the moment you make this, and again, I'm saying I don't have 100% answer for this, but the moment you put this under the law of rape, then it becomes 7 years and 3 years. Or if you're looking at a broken limb, when you're going to our IPC, the amount of punishment for that is less than for rape. And the moment we're doing that, we're also saying rape is worse than physical harm. I'm just saying that is one of the things that we need to keep, in mind. That are we falling into the trap of doing the same thing as the patriarchal, judge who said the worst form of violence a woman can ever face?
Yeah, that's like the legal part of it is how many years and all. That's one side of it, and I totally agree with you that it should be similar to other grievous bodily harm. Probably, I am talking about the lack of consent, which becomes an issue of not getting recognized when it is within the marriage, even if it is not accompanied by grievous bodily harm. So that is where actually the problem happens. But I think it's...
Professor Uma, please go ahead if you have a comment.
Yeah, thank you. I think the point that Anuradha is raising is a very important one, and it's also similar to what Audrey said, right? So why are we placing a hierarchy between various forms of domestic violence within the criminal law? But the converse question is, and I'm not denying, I mean, I'm saying this for the sake of, getting more clarity. I'm just giving a response to it, is that, yes, we agree that marital rape is one of the many forms of violence that happens within a marriage. But are we okay with having a hierarchy between rape of, married women and rape of unmarried women? Are we okay with that hierarchy? Because that is a hierarchy which the exception to 375 is bringing. Exception 2 to 375 is bringing. So I think what is the message that exception is giving? That is one aspect. Of course, 498A includes all forms of physical and mental violence, which means sexual violence is included. So there is no doubt about it. But in addition to what Anuradha was saying about how, the problem of 498A is that it is left to the imagination of the writer, and this writer is not even the station house officer. We are talking about, probably one of the lowest cadre within the police station, writing this down in a language that he is comfortable with. We also must remember that there are directives given by various commissioners of police, saying that, do not file an FIR for under 498A unless you are sure about this, that, and the other. We have Rajesh Sharma judgment, which has technically been reversed, but the damage that Rajesh Sharma judgment caused is that it validated the patriarchal mindset among so many people. And Rajesh Sharma judgment actually said that 498A is, in a sense, I mean, I'm not verbally just quoting it, but it said that 498A is wreaking havoc. Fathers-in-law, mothers-in-law, sisters-in-law, everybody is being arrested. So let us form a committee that committee will examine whether there is any substance or not. It will call the wife, it will call the husband, it will inquire and then file an FIR, right? Now, subsequently, that judgment was repealed by a subsequent judgment, but that state of mind of the institutions continues to remain. So, given that patriarchal mindset which is embedded in the institutions, will having this exception to section 375, will it not just be providing one more armor in their favor? And by removing it, you are giving the message that it is not okay to rape within marriage. At the same time, that doesn't mean that every woman is going to run to the police station, because what is the conviction for even rape outside marriage? Conviction rate is so low, investigation is horrible, and it is because of investigation that these cases weaken. So this is a counter in a sense, but this is also just to kind of brainstorm, because I find, with Anuradha here, with Juma, with Audrey, with Prajna, I think it's a good space for us to actually brainstorm without having to get into either technicalities or becoming judgmental about each other's position.
Thank you. Juma, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think some of it is again covered by Somi. I wanted to raise this 490, the difficulty of, filing anything under, on a 498A. And especially, and it is not just Rajesh Sharma. Rajesh Sharma was like the last nail, it's been going on for some while, if you just look at trace and in fact, my work with Prajna has been on 498A, the Rajaram Grit Fellowship. So if one looks at, if one just traces the trajectory of this threat of perceived threat of 498A by, I'm going to forget, men's rights groups entered the scene much later, but by the institution, as early as I think 1989, and this was just a few years after 498A was inscribed into the statute, Punjab and Haryana High Court said that this has the potential to become a Frankensteinian monster. And then that language of legal Frankensteinian monster, legal terrorism, and so on and so forth, that is something which has pervaded this judicial discourse. And this is also that this has migrated into the public, into the public arena. The men's rights groups, the Save the Indian Foundation, Indian Family, and all that, they have invited these hero judges, these Delhi High Court judges. I'm not going to name them, but if you just try to hunt for those judgments, you will find who these judges are. They have been invited as keynote speakers, and so it's a really nice give and take industry. So this has happened, and this continues to happen. Rajesh Sharma was it was so bad, it was so obnoxious, because even the committee, that was to be formed under Rajesh Sharma's direction, that did not include trained personnel. That included your mohallas, the neighborhood uncles and aunties who would sit there, and they would decide. They would have the final say whether something could be sent to the they would screen an application. So 498A, there is a there is a lot of challenges of bringing something under 498A. 498 is filed. I'm not going to say that it's not filed, but it is only filed when you have a lawyer. You can afford a good lawyer who can then take it up, go to the thana, help you in filing that. And it is used mostly in cases, in my experience, it has been used mostly in cases to get maintenance out, maintenance which is constantly denied. It is it is brought down after some months or maybe years of fighting it out in the court. For a 5,000 rupees maintenance is going to come down to 3,000 rupees, and then it's going to, and then even then that is not going to be paid. So 498A is filed at that juncture. It is used as a tool to bring the the husband to the discussion table. This is it's used, it's in that sense, but I'm not going to say that that is a misuse, as is understood by a legislature. It has a certain purpose. Now, 498 is also used in other contexts. If one can afford it, in the sense, if one can afford a lawyer, if one can afford, if one has that kind of social, that safety network and all that, one could perhaps, file a 498A, include, because cruelty, as Anuradha very rightly pointed out, cruelty includes all forms of cruelty. And if one actually looks at if one looks at the sort of the ambit of matrimonial law, you will see that, that it has been, it's not a case that that sexual violence is, violence on wife is completely unrecognized in matrimonial laws, because it is also recognized, although different high courts have different opinions on this, it is also recognized by certain high courts as a form of cruelty, as a form of civil cruelty, which then forms your ground of divorce. And after the PWDVA category, because PWDVA has so many categories, it's PWDVA, because the ones who brought PWDVA, they were perfectly aware of the challenges of filing something and of this predicament that might come up. So therefore, in that long list of offenses, of abuses, sexual abuse is spelled out, So therefore, PWDVA, you actually see in PWDVA, marital rape, there is a recognition. It is not recognized as rape, it is recognized as a form of sexual abuse. So, so that's why I said earlier that I agree with Audrey that it is not we do not live in a society where there is no recognition of sexual abuse in marriage. As far as marital rape exemption goes, that question is somewhat different. The question is whether it is not a question of criminalizing marital rape, because I think often we conflate what removal of a section does, and I think this is something that emerged even in 377 as well, in a different manner, that if we remove that exemption, then the ones who we would earlier refer to as criminals, now we cannot refer to them as criminals, and what happens to the boy child. So this is what the logic of the legislature was. But in marital rape, in somewhat in a different way, but also somewhat in a similar fashion, in marital rape, once we remove the exemption as a normative response to our constitutional goals, that women are they, because the state does have a responsibility to protect and uphold women's rights, and their guaranteed rights under under Article 14, 15, and so there, so if the state continues to contain or retain this exemption under a statute, then what does it really say about the state? Is the state then doing what it is supposed to do, or is the state then completely buckling under patriarchal forces? And patriarchal forces are not just the individuals, it is the institutions largely as well. So I think we need to really sort of complicate this discourse further, because in any case, marital rape, it has been, there is a recognition of marital rape. There's a recognition, not if not marital rape, of sexual abuse in law, in civil law, as well as in criminal law, because in 498A also there is a recognition, and there is a recognition in civil law as well, be it your regular Hindu Marriage Act and other personal laws, or be it your your PWDVA. So I think I'll stop here.
Thank you. I think we have a question also from Dr. Swarna Rajgopalan of Prajna. She says, in the interest of public education, so that your responses are on the record, let me ask the question about false complaints. The discourse about abuse of the law is also mixed in with all this, isn't it? Would you like to respond to this? Any of you?
I don't know. I think that this abuse of the law is a much abused term, right? Women my own experiences, they barely use the law. So actually, you know, when we're talking about abuse, we should be talking about lack of use rather than abuse, okay? The second reason I think the problematic statement on abuse of law is that, and you know, Juma, you mentioned that a lot of the times the law is used as a tool to bring the man to the negotiating table. And then after that, there is they go to court, and then there is a sort of, you know, the woman will say, I'm withdrawing my complaint, and so on and so forth. And all those cases are then looked upon as false cases. And that's a huge problem, because then, you know, and I'm just thinking as you were talking that when there will be a law on rape, marital rape, the same, you know, we're not even getting conviction on 498A. Right? Which is a much lesser sort of crime to get a conviction on. Will we get conviction on marital rape, and what will happen there? How will we prove it? You know, the same issues will come up, and it will be frustrating. But you, like I said, I don't have 100% answer for this. It's a very complicated issue, as you said. I mean, it has so many ifs and buts attached to it. And then if you look at the you know, the actual way in which law operates or not in women's favor, which we are seeing, it doesn't operate in women's favor. Women are constantly battling to get even the smallest of, relief from the court, and then the problem becomes of the implementation. Okay, so now I'm at a stage where I feel if I have to put my energies, I'm just talking about myself, I want energies to put into implementation. Really speaking, that if we get another law, we will be faced with the same issues, right? So in a sense, if I'm looking at how do we make these laws work for women, even PWDVA, when we brought it, one of the biggest things that I kept saying and emphasizing was we've got to put in clauses that make sure implementation happens. And even there, we're finding implementation is becoming a problem. There's so many loopholes for implementation. So I think that between these two things, one, that law doesn't work in women's favor, and when women are using it to get whatever basic stuff they're using to get, it gets caught up in that rhetoric of misuse. And that is also because patriarchal society is being questioned. And once it is, there will be a backlash. And the backlash comes in the form of men saying women are misusing, and judges making these massive comments without any evidence base to say that women are actually misusing the law. And I mean, if we were to see the number of cases of domestic violence that come to us that are eligible under this 498A, a very small percentage of women actually use it. And then who are the ones who can wield it as a misuse are only very powerful, rich women. In a way, if you want to see who can misuse this law, it may be a handful, but that's the discourse again that comes every time a woman uses a law. If you use it, it's misuse. That's the way I think people look at it. It's just a huge problem.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So I just want to add to what Anuradha said about, the arguments against misuse, against this myth of misuse. And one of the other things is, if we look at any social legislations, whether it is for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, POCSO, or 498A, Domestic Violence Act, all of these which challenge certain status quo, all these laws are, you have groups which are status quoist, which have either a patriarchal casteist privilege, you have them saying that there's going to be a misuse. So that is just one more argument that I'm adding on to what Anuradha said. Recently, I was in a panel discussion on marital rape, where we had panelists from the US. And they were talking about, and this was a feminist law academician from US, and she was talking about how, despite having a marital rape provision in law, how difficult it is for conviction, right? And she was talking about, she said that there are very few, and rape is also a gender neutral crime there. And despite that, it was so, she says that it is only where there was absolute direct evidence where a man was raping his wife in the presence of guests. Only in those kind of cases has the husband been convicted of marital rape. And in other cases, many other cases, it doesn't even come up, for trial because of the prosecutor's discretion and so on. So the question that Anuradha is asking is very important. Just because we remove this exception to section exception 2 to section 375, does that guarantee that women will have, married women will have a better deal? No, it doesn't guarantee. But do we want it on the statute books that it is, do we want this exception that gives a clear message that within marriage, it is okay to rape, but outside marriage, it is a crime? Do we want that message to go? There is no, I mean, women are getting a raw deal out of rape as well, yet the rape provision stays. Women may not get justice out of the marital rape provision in criminal law if it comes, because what is being asked right now is remove the exception, right? But even then, I mean, that is something that all of us as feminists, as women's organizations, as feminist advocates, feminist academics, that is part of our effort and challenges in future, right? And when I heard this US, feminists talk about the challenges that they are facing there, when they have a good law on paper, and we are like several hundreds of steps further behind. But I think that is a challenge that we have to deal with at that point in time. And I agree with what Anuradha is saying, that we focus on strengthening implementation and demanding institutional accountability for proper and prompt institutional response, and to remove this embedded bias which exists in the judiciary, in the police, and all of that. So that is a second level of fight. But I think the first level is having this artificial distinction between rape of unmarried women and rape of married women, which Juma, as constitutional law academic, she was talking about this rational nexus and differentia and all of that. So that is what we are looking at. And after Puttaswamy, where Justice Verma committee report itself has talked very, very strongly about bodily integrity, sexual autonomy, privacy. And then after Puttaswamy judgment, it has taken it even further. So in the light of that, is it okay to have this hierarchy in criminal law between married and unmarried women as far as rape is concerned? I think that is what we look at. And yes, it will be challenging. Yes, women will find it difficult to talk. Children find it difficult to talk about sexual violence by their father, by their uncle. Women find it difficult to talk about rape. But that is where victims' rights and socio-legal support to victims comes in. And I think the role of organizations like Swayam and Majlis are very, very important in doing that.
Go ahead.
I'll just, just continue. I'll just add a few things to what Soumya said. And, it's interesting that, so Swarna asked about the question about false complaints and false, what does a false complaint in law look like? So if in very plain legal sense, in plain evidentiary, if one looks at the evidentiary categories, there is, something can be proved, something is, may not be proved, and then there is something that can be disproved. So law, so this is how evidentiary categories are mapped. And it is not always the case that everything can be proved, because in order to prove something, XYZ, whatever, you need a lot of things, and especially in a context of a matrimonial dispute or something which is happening in the inside the four walls of a home, where there is no, you don't really necessarily, you may not have a third party to witness it. Soumya was talking about marital rape, and how if it's happening in public glare, then an action is taken. So I think this, we need to understand we need to understand, we need to talk about law a little more, and understand that how this not proved and disproved categories are conflated. So if something is not proved, someone may file a 498A case, and 498A cases do not reach, end up in, it's a, courts have made them, compoundable, in that sense. It is the court's doing, because it was the court and police, there is this whole sort of this, this trajectory of what happens in the life of a 498A case. I'm not getting into that, but even if something goes in the court, a 498A case that reaches in the court, and where the petitioner, the complainant, the de facto complainant, who's the wife, who's not able to prove, because it is not always possible to prove something, and if it is not proved, then it does not mean that it is disproved. It does not automatically mean that that she's this is a false case. So we need to understand, what do we mean, or what does someone mean when someone says that these are false cases? What is the definition of false? Is there a legal the definition of false in your entire your IPC? Is there something on, one can talk about perjury and all that, but that is a separate 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 thing to deal with. But when we are talking about just plain in terms of evidentiary categories, not everything that is not proved, that does not become disproved. That is one point. The second point is about what do we do? What do we do about it? Because Anuradha earlier mentioned that even with the PWDVA, the problem is with the implementation. The problem is with the implementation of, across the board. You name a law, because this, and I think Flavia had mentioned that I really love that quote, that if any age could have been said the golden age of legislation for women, that would have been the 80s, because you had a law for everything. You just, you demanded, there was something happening, and you walked up outside the corridors on the corridors of the court, or outside the gates of the Supreme Court, or you sat in a dharna and there was a law. I'm simplifying it, of course. I'm oversimplifying it, but none of that has really made a lot of difference to women's lives. So what does one do about it? One has to train the ones who implement these laws, who execute these. So we need to train our judges. We need to know, for example, if one talks about, I'm just digressing a bit, and talk, if one thinks of special, rape law and special courts, what is happening in the special courts? You have special courts. You are supposed to have judges who are specially trained. You're supposed to have prosecutors who are specially trained. Your even defense lawyers need to be trained. And you still see, the Tejpal judgment is out fairly recently. You see, and it takes place in a special court, and you see the kind of language that has been allowed by the judge, the kind of defense the defense lawyers have been allowed to take, and one really asks that what is really happening with the special court. And then the same manner, what is happening in the family courts? Because family court, or a regular family court judge is is trained if some training happens, it's training. I have done some work, trainings are, family court training is like really, it's very disparate in different parts of the country. If some training happens, the force of it will be to protect the institution of marriage, protect the family, because that is what is also inscribed in the law, in the Family Courts Act. So when a judge is sitting there with to use a very layperson's word, with the mindset, with that mindset, if a judge is sitting there that I need to protect the family, I need to protect the institution of marriage, and if there is if there are charges, forget criminal charges. I'm not getting into criminal, this is a family court, but if there are, let's say, if there are charges of sexual violence in marriage, as a form of cruelty, for which a woman asks, a wife says that I need to have a divorce, the judge is going to be shocked. And even, I have come across cases, custody cases, where the mother has alleged that there's been sexual violence on the child, and the judge has taken a very serious stand against the mother, and because the judge thinks that this is unheard of. Like, why would a father go and sexually abuse his child? So we really need to train our judges. We need to train our, in the family court, we need to train our judges beyond the Family Courts Act and beyond these patriarchal notions of marriage, family, etc. That is not happening. One doesn't even know what is happening with the Nirbhaya Fund. I don't know if I think the others who work more closely with with program and policy might be able to shed some money, because the Nirbhaya Fund, it had so much money it generated. As far as my knowledge goes, that CCTV cameras are being installed with largely with that fund. So we don't really know what is happening. So we need to have transparency. We need to train our judges. We need to ensure that our judges not only know the law, they also know how to apply, how to understand the law, because mostly what happens is it's a very technical, judges or lawyers, anyone who's part of this system, they have a very technical, sort of legal technical reading of the law. They do not get into the sort of the nitty-gritties, the nuances, and all that. We also need to train, most importantly, along with judges, we need to train our police. I don't think I need to sort of overstate this. Our investigating agencies, the police is in any case, the police is the first sort of port of call, and that was the logic of the PWDVA, to ensure that the police, if a woman goes to the police, the police informs her that these are the remedies, and can send the woman to to a protection officer, and so on and so forth. But that is not happening. If you go to the police and if you claim that there is a domestic violence, marpeet, the police will still say that call the husband, and there is going to be some panchayati form of justice that will be delivered. The husband will be said, why are you beating your wife? Please go back home and take care of each other. So there is no way out really, unless we learn how to train the ones who execute our laws, implement, execute, and interpret our laws.
Thanks, Juma. I think we have one final question on consent more broadly, which I think is also a good way for us to wrap up this session, which did want to look at how marital rape and legislation around marital rape ties into the question of consent. I think before I read that out, I have a very, I hope, a quick question, and I think it's a somewhat simplistic question. As someone who's not a lawyer, I hope you'll indulge me, since we have all these experts here. I did want to ask, I had actually assumed before this session that even though Section 498A says that, any kind of cruelty is a sort of criminal offense, the fact that there is this exception in Section 375 almost kind of nullifies it, or can be used as a counter to that. I just was wondering if you could explain a bit about why it seems like those two things can exist together. They can sort of be seen as separate things. You can still go to court under Section 498A and try a case of marital rape. So I was just wondering if you could just quickly say how that would work.
Okay, since should I? If anybody else is responding, I will keep quiet. Okay.
Soumya, you go and then maybe I'll think if I can add something.
Okay, so 498A talks about a range of violence, right? So it talks about physical and mental violence, and within physical violence, we are situating sexual violence definitely as one aspect of it, but sexual violence need not be only rape, correct? It can be pornography, showing pornography, being forced to act out the pornographic film. It could be various such forms. When we talk about rape, we are talking about penetration. Although the concept of penetration has broadened after the 2013 amendment, so it has broadened. It's now not only penetration of the it's not only penile penetration of the vagina, it's also penetration of the mouth, it's penetration of any other orifice, using an object, all of that. But there is some form of, there is a physical, penetrative element to it, intrusive element to it, which Section 498A doesn't have. So in that sense, 498A, if we are talking about sexual violence aspect, I would see it to be broader than Section 375. I think it is, even though it has these different, firstly, secondly, it has these different clauses, I still think it is more restrictive. So that is my quick answer, but I look forward to Juma. She may or may not agree with me, but yeah.
No, I mean, I don't think I need to add on. You pretty much clarified it.
Okay, thank you. I think we're really more or less out of time. So what I'm actually going to do is just read out this question, which says, let me see where it is. The other complaint we hear is also that having to keep asking for consent makes relationships contrived or somehow not real. How do we change this thinking? Even outside the context of marital rape, the courts have been giving opinions about consent. The question moves you away from law, but really just to sort of, I think this is really a much broader question than perhaps what we can address within the focus of this particular session. But if you could all maybe just say something about consent in the context of marital rape, if you have any concluding thoughts just to wrap up, that would be fantastic.
As I have written in the chat, Shakti, I think that there is a need for much more talk about consent. It needs to be part of our daily upbringing, right? It's not only about intimate relationships, it's also about all familial relationships. Is it okay for a parent to open the diary of a child and read what the child has written? Isn't there a sense of consent involved there? Is it okay for a husband to open his wife's mobile phone and check her WhatsApp messages? Isn't there a sense of consent there? Is it okay for a brother to open the sister's wallet and take out money without asking her? There is consent in all of these. And I think there needs to be much more talk about consent. And I think it is a value that we all have to imbibe and implement in our daily relationships, so that, some years from now, this question will not really be an issue. But before a man kisses a woman or whatever, you know, it will be a natural response to ask for consent. Consent has to become normalized. Right now, it is not in so many different spheres. And I think that unboxing consent, which, you know, the series of short films which Partners for Law in Development has made, those are excellent. And I have used it in many of my training sessions. And I find that it is fascinating for the kind of discussion it opens up about consent. I think those are some of the indicators, some of the ways forward that I would see. Thank you.
I think actually we will stop here because we are really out of time. We have another program at 5. I'd just like to say thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to Juma, to Audrey, and also to Samya and Anuradha for your insightful comments, you know, and adding so much to this already rich discussion. And I think we have, you know, I think this video also will be a fantastic resource. We've all, I think, learned a lot. Those of us who are not experts in this area have learned a lot through this session. I think there are now requests for a group photo. Maybe if we can quickly take one before we conclude. Mariam, are you taking the